Welcome to the Manhattan GMAT Study Hall for June 2nd, 2011. We are going to be doing a couple more instances of inference and suggestion questions from reading comp. So basically this session is going to be a continuation of the session from April 28th. In which we had similar questions, and that proved, the feedback we got was that session apparently was quite popular. So we're going to do a little bit more of this. It'll take us up till 5:30 Pacific, 8:30 Eastern. We may be finishing a couple minutes early, but we'll do the usual. So let's take a look. As usual, we have to start out with the normal warnings that we always give you guys. So let's do that. You guys kind of know how this works by now, but don't submit problems that are too general. Some people have, one gentleman in the last couple of weeks actually asked, how do I do verbal questions better? Which, the concern there is understandable, but you've got to realize that that's the entire verbal section of the test. And as such, is not something we could reasonably cover in a short period of time. At the same time, please don't submit problems that are too specific. This is the forums are for this type of problem. This is probably the single biggest guideline that people are not following, is don't submit problems that are too specific. This is why we have the forums that we have. ManhattanGMAT.com/forums. These are very active with questions that are like this. So if you just have a question about one problem and there are no connections to other problems, like if it's just I don't get these two answer choices of this one problem, please post those on the forum. The study hall is meant to cover slightly more, organized and themed topics. Also, please don't submit personal issues. Remember that these recordings are watched by hundreds of people. Some of the more popular ones have been watched by thousands of people. So it's not the kind of forum where we would want to treat people's personal study plans. Again, we have a place on the forums for that. If you're asking about study plans for the GMAT, we have a general questions folder on the forums. That is the purpose of that folder, to address questions about study plans and overall strategy. If your question is about admissions, we do partner up with an admissions firm. We're Manhattan GMAT. We're not Manhattan Admissions, so that's not really our game. But we do have a partner firm called MBA Mission that addresses these questions in their own folder on our forum. So again, please don't submit these kinds of questions here. Finally, please do not submit problems from the official guide. The official guide is a banned source on this forum, as it is on the study hall. GMAC has had that little chat with us about protecting their copyright. So in that little chat, they were like, please don't use OG problems, thank you. Same reason that you're not allowed to post OG problems on the forum. So if you submit OG problems, we will have to ignore them, so please don't. Okay. What we do want to see is topics of intermediate depth. Either just give us a theme of intermediate depth or ask us a specific problem with a more general tie-in. So for example, today's theme is more of these inference and suggestion type questions. But if you're going to submit that, please don't submit a single inference question. That's the domain of the forum. Instead, say, I have trouble with inference questions in general. Can you please help? So that kind of thing. Also, please check the archives for topics. There are currently 35 or 36 of these sessions so far. That's a lot of sessions. We have already covered a lot of stuff. So if you submit something that is already the topic of a previous study hall, then we're probably not going to cover it again because we don't really want to repeat ourselves here. We don't want reruns. So please check the archives to make sure that your topic is not already there. Okay, but just to make sure we understand that we're all on the same page here, just to recap a couple of the more important points. About problem submissions. Please, no individual problems. Post these on the forum. Please, no OG problems. This is the big offender in the last couple of weeks. We had a lot of people submitting OG problems. Unfortunately, we can't address these. If you want to ask a question about an OG problem, what you're going to have to do is write, if you have a question about an OG problem, what you're going to have to do is write your own version of the problem. So in other words, use the same idea, but a different problem. If it's a math problem, change some of the numbers, change some of the specifics. If it's a verbal problem, then change some of the words in the sentence or make it about something that's new. But we can't address the original OG problems. Then post it on the forum in the general, whichever one applies to you, in the general math or general verbal folder. Okay. This is the two biggest. Not very many people are submitting things like study hall or study plans. But please, no individual problems, and please, no OG problems. Give me a smiley face if you guys understand these rules. Remember that the smiley face is over there on the left next to the names. Smiley face if you understand. Okay. Let's recap what we learned. Remember that the theme of today is more inference and suggestion questions. Let's go ahead and recap what we've learned about these questions from last time. Anybody in the text box? So what have we learned about RC, inference, and suggestion questions? Shouldn't be two question marks. Okay, does anybody in the text box want to give a brief summary of what we have learned about these things? Or like what we know about them in general? General treatment. Okay. Got a couple people typing. One person apparently stopped typing. So yeah, that's right. What you have in the text box here is mostly what we're looking for. The inference questions are not what inference means in the normal conversational context. So what we've learned is that inference and even suggestion don't mean what they mean in real life. What they mean on this test, inference and suggestion refer to, you want to know basically what has to be true. So they refer to statements that must be true according to the information in the passage. Okay, this is weird because when people say inference in real life, this is not what they mean. Okay, so again, we did some illustrations in the April 28th study hall. We'll do a couple more illustrations now just to make sure we're all on the same page here. So for some illustrations, see the April 28th, 2011 study hall recording. But this is not what inference means in real life. So let's go ahead and take a look at another example that is not one of those old examples. This is not what these words mean in conversation. So here's an example. Let's say your passage is this. Again, it's kind of a silly passage, but it'll work for illustrative purposes. Here's your passage. Rob walked past a bowl of candies in his office. Rob walked past a bowl of candies that contained 50 red and 50 green candies, thoroughly mixed. Once, when Rob passed the bowl, he selected 10 red candies and no green candies from the bowl. Let's change selected to took. Okay. Does anybody want to give me an inference from this information? In his office, Rob walked past a bowl of candies that contained 50 red and 50 green candies, thoroughly mixed. When Rob passed the bowl, he took 10 red candies and no green ones. Does anybody want to try giving me an inference? See what a couple of people type. Okay, I like the variety of answers here because we have all of the different kinds of answers that we're looking for are basically here. So, okay, inference and suggestion. Let's talk about these. I'm going to pull a few of your statements out of the text box and let's talk about it. So remember that we're looking for things that must be true. Okay, there are basically two kinds of correct inferences that you're going to see. And when I say two kinds, it's going to depend on the way in which you view this stuff. Because to some people, these aren't even going to seem like different kinds of things. But to other people, they're going to seem massively different. And so it really just depends on who you are and how you process things. But, okay, there's two kinds of correct inferences that you might see. The first kind you might see is statements that can actually be rigorously proved from the information at hand. So a couple of you guys wrote statements that are like this. This one, for instance, and this one. These are both correct inferences of this type, where they are things that have to be true. So there's one. There's another one. So, I mean, these are not exactly the most brilliant genius deductions in the world, but they are things that have to be true from the information here. Like if Rob took no greens and took 10 reds, then we do know for sure that there are 50 greens left in the bowl. And we also do know for sure that there are 40 red and 50 green remaining in the bowl. This is basically just a restatement of existing information. Okay, smiley face if you guys understand this. Okay, so that's one type of inference, is literal, almost mathematically provable statements. The other kind of correct inference is statements that can't be rigorously proved, but could only be false but for which it would be absolutely ridiculous for them to be false. um, for which it would be. So, like, for instance, I mean, the wording there looks a little bit awkward on paper. Like, in other words, in different words, you can say something like, in other words, statements that must be true in all reasonable situations. Like the difference between, let me give you an example of number 2. One of you guys have an example of this in the box, and then I'll give you another one. Here's one example that someone submitted in the text box just now. Rob deliberately selected only red candies. And also, you could write this very similar idea, but you could write it in different terms as Rob's method of selecting candies was not random. So these are statements that, okay, now depending on who you are, you might think of these as the same kind of thing. Like, if the normal way that you process statements is kind of a common sense sort of way where you reject, things that are absurd, then to you there will be no difference between number 1 and number 2 here. Because, I mean, to people who process things in a more real-world, common sense sort of way, when we say prove, those people think anyway in terms of rejecting ridiculous possibilities. But if you normally think like a computer programmer or like a mathematician or like some other technical people who always have to consider all possibilities all the time, then these two will be very different to you, and you will have to learn to look for both of them. Like, in other words, if you're a programmer, then you can't, if a bug is in the code, then you have to get the bug out of the code, and it doesn't matter how unlikely it is that someone will trigger that bug. Even if the bug would only be a bug if somebody did exactly these 100 steps in a row, it doesn't matter, and it's still a bug, and you have to get rid of it. So that's the difference between the kind of way that programmers and tech people think and the way that everybody else thinks about stuff. So if you think in that very sort of tech person kind of way, you're going to need to separately look for these 2 types of inferences, because for you, these will be different things. Whereas if you think in more of the kind of common sense business person sort of way, where you just don't think about ridiculous cases in the first place, then these are the same. So, for instance, these statements here basically say that Rob picked the red candies on purpose. This is not a statement that you can mathematically prove, but the only way this could be false would be if you reached into a thoroughly mixed bowl of candies and somehow came up with all 10 red. And that's just not a reasonable situation. So from the standpoint of this kind of GMAT problem, you just don't worry about that kind of exception, and you say this has to be true. So does this make sense? Smiley face if this does make sense. If you have any questions about this, please type them in the text box. Okay, now what we also have in the text box is at least 1 or 2 examples of what you do not want to see. Let me compress some of this so I can have more space to type. There's 1 or 2 examples of what we don't want to see, which, like the first submission was this one. But there's 2 kinds of wrong inferences. The first kind of wrong inference is a statement that has to be false. I mean, nobody submitted these. But statements that are actually false or that contradict the passage. I don't think I need to explain that to anybody. I mean, if something is false according to the passage, then don't pick it. On the other hand, what gives people trouble here is statements about which we are guessing or making assumptions, extra assumptions. In other words, notice the distinction between this and number 2 over here. This number 2 is if the only exceptions to something are ridiculous, then it's a valid inference. Like, these things have exceptions, but the exceptions are all kind of stupid. Like, you know, the only exception to this would be if you reached into a bowl completely at random and somehow managed to come up with all red, which is basically not going to happen. I mean, you could make that a math problem if you wanted to, and your probability would be, you know, 0.00000000000 something. But the point is not to make it into a math problem. The point is to think about that and say that is just not worth considering. On the other hand, when we talk about these statements here, we're talking about statements that could reasonably be false. In other words, statements that may or may not be true within reason. So you do have to apply a certain amount of common sense to some of these questions. Like, the within reason part here is key. Like, this is a statement that, this up here is a statement that may or may not be true, but not within reason. Like, this statement, within any case that is not ridiculous, this statement is going to be true. On the other hand, here's a statement that was in the text box that is incorrect for this reason. Rob does not like green candies. We don't know this. Like, this is based on guessing or making extra assumptions, because there are lots of other reasons that Rob might be picking these things. Like, maybe he's picking them for someone else. Maybe the green candies, you know, got him sick last time, or, you know, maybe he has some other reason. Like, he doesn't have to like them. And so here you're making the extra assumption that he's picking the candies that he likes. It's not ridiculous to think that that might be false. In other words, that he might be picking them for some other reason. So that's the difference. The difference is this statement has plenty of exceptions that are reasonable, whereas this statement has no exceptions at all up here, and this statement only has exceptions that are kind of stupid. So smiley face if this makes sense, if you guys understand what's going on here. Again, it's going to be a situation in which, hold on just a second, please, sorry. Sorry about that, guys. It depends, again, it depends on the mentality with which you normally approach these problems. I mean, if you normally approach these problems with a very real-world way of thinking about these things, which is an advantage in most of the critical reasoning in RC, but a disadvantage in some cases, then these to you will be the same. If you think about these things very technically in most cases, then to you these two kinds of things will be extremely different. But the key is, no matter what your outlook is on this stuff in general, you do have to be able to spot both of these types of inferences. Smiley face if this makes sense. Non-smiley face if it doesn't. If you have any questions about this before we get started, please type them in the text box. If you don't, then we'll go ahead and start looking at some questions. Okay, let's look at a problem. So Here's the first one. Remember, okay, here's how this is going to work. I don't know if any of you are new to the study hall scene here. If you are, here's how this works. You should see now, they weren't there a second ago, but you should see the following in the corner of your screen. Below the list of names, you should see this. You should see these polling buttons right here. Please use these buttons. The other students in the study hall will not see your answer. Please indicate your answer with these buttons. Please do not write your answer in the text box. Because if you do, well, we want to make sure this is an individual effort for everybody, and if there are answers that are visible in the text box, then, you know, whether we like it or not, those are going to start influencing other people's responses. So if, just to make sure we're all on the same page here, and just to make sure you can all find these buttons, please indicate answer A, just to make sure you know where these things are at. Please indicate answer A. Let's make sure you can all find them. Okay, there's still, let's see, there's still a Billy who hasn't done this, and there's still a Cyrus, two Cyruses. Maybe those are the same person. And Junaid Zahir. Billy, can you find these things? Cyrus, can you find these things? Junaid, can you find these things? Please go ahead and actually click A to make sure that your polling is working. Okay. All right, good. Everybody's got it. All right, excellent. Here's the first problem. Please go ahead and indicate your answer with, I'll give you about 1.5 to 2 minutes. Please indicate your answer with the buttons. Okay. If it's a little, this is from GMAT Prep. All of the questions in today's lesson are from GMAT Prep. So, FYI. I'll give you a timer of, here's your timer. Okay, the wording here is a little bit difficult, but if you need another 20 or 30 seconds, take it. But please try not to take longer than that. So everybody pick something in the next 20 seconds or so. If I said minutes, I meant seconds, 20 or 30 seconds. Okay, it's time to pick something. Remember that this is the GMAT. The GMAT is a test on which you are not allowed to abstain from questions. You're not allowed to not answer things, basically. So remember that you have to pick something. So we're looking at, there's a CKA, there's a Cyrus, Karaoke, there's a Hadi, and a Jani who don't have answers here. So please indicate something, even if you are guessing. Okay, Hadi, CKA, next few seconds. All right, here are your responses. So most of you guys nailed this. This is good. The correct answer here is A. Basically what you're doing is you're just going through the neighborhood of the surrounding lines here. So go through the local area in the passage and just pick the statement that must be true. And remember, in all cases, I mean, you're going to be looking at things that are pretty close to. In other words, the statement is going to very close to the existing information. So what they're saying is this. Some scholars have argued that even though, if you don't even know what laissez-faire is, then that's still fine. I mean, try not to get lost in terms. Even though something eventually became big, it was not accepted without a struggle. In other words, it met some resistance. The resistance was that it clashed with these norms that did a bunch of stuff. So basically what these words mean is what the underlined words say is that this laissez-faire economics, even if you don't exactly know what that is, it doesn't matter. Just look at what they're saying about it. Laissez-faire met with resistance from these social norms before it became predominant. So you basically want the answer choice that says that, or that says something that has to be true, if that is true. So of these choices, the one that basically gives you this idea is this one. They provided notice a primary source, not the primary source. That's an important difference. Like there could have been other sources as well. But if it's a primary source, that just means that it's something that provided important opposition here. So someone click the raise hand button. If you've got a question, please go ahead and type the question in the text box, and I'll just go ahead and address it as we go. So Billy, if you got a question, just go ahead and type it. But yeah, it provided, these norms provided resistance to the laissez-faire system. As far as the other answer choices go, let's talk about why the other answer choices are not correct. Choice B says, let's go ahead and take this to another page so we can talk about that. All right, let's get rid of this. Okay. Okay, we'll address that question in a second. First, let's talk about the rest of the answer choices. Choice B says their appeal was undermined by difficult economic times. It doesn't say that. In fact, it suggests that the opposite is true. Like you have these norms persisted for a long time, and even in the late 19th century, laissez-faire had not triumphed completely. In other words, the blue words are suggesting the opposite. So when it comes to B, the blue underline is suggesting that even at the end of the 19th century, laissez-faire had not triumphed completely. In other words, its opposition, and the only opposition that they mention is these norms. So the only opposition that you can consider to be present here is these norms. So was still in place. That's the problem with this choice. Undermined would mean that these norms were not relevant anymore, or that people didn't do anything according to them. C is an even stronger statement that is false for the same reasons. So C is basically, C is very similar to B, but even stronger. So if B is not justified, then C is most certainly not justified. As far as choice D goes, they don't mention, let's see, but buttressed by mercantilist notions that government should be both regulator and promoter. The problem with D is that it's backwards. Like what you've got here is what choice D says is it says facilitated. So the wording of D says, the actual words in D say that the norms led to, which is facilitated. I mean, facilitated doesn't, directly mean led to, but it means they made it easier for this to happen. So it's catalyzed. Led to or catalyzed, if you know what catalyzed means, the implementation of mercantilist norms. The problem here is that of mercantilist notions of government. The problem is that it's not what the passage says. I mean, this is a statement that may be reasonable, but if you look at the words that are written over here, buttressed by mercantilist notions, buttressed means supported. These norms persisted long after the American Revolution. So what the passage says is the other way around. The passage says that the mercantilist notions were there, and they allowed the norms to persist longer. So when you strip this down, what you basically have is backward causation. Like choice D is saying that the norms led to the mercantilist notions of government. But the passage actually says that it's backwards. The passage says that the mercantilist notions were just there, and they let the norms live on for longer. So, I mean, the passage doesn't tell you anything about what made these things get implemented in the first place. So D was picked by a couple of people. That's the problem with D. And then the choice E, the ideology of the American Revolution, is not relevant to the passage. So it does say that the norms were around at the time of the revolution and they lasted long afterwards, but that doesn't mean they were part of the ideology of the revolution itself. The ideology of the revolution itself is not considered. Okay, the question in the text box, we're going to go there in a second. But does everybody understand what we're saying about these other answer choices? Smiley face if you do, other face if you don't. Okay, here's the question in the text box. It's a good question, so let's talk about it. Here's the question. Let's go ahead and copy and paste this again onto another page. Let's get rid of these other colored lines. Okay, so the question from the text box is this. How do we know it was a primary source? Is primary not making this answer too strong? What you have to do is you have to realize that these passages are going to be written in ways that make sense. Okay, so we'll come back to this problem in a second, but let me give you an example. If I say something like, let's say I wrote the following in, an email or in some description of my friend or something like that. My friend has a hard time playing well in his weekend basketball games. Period. Lately, his bad knee has been bothering him so much that he hasn't even been able to run up and down the basketball court at full speed. Okay. Here's a reasonable inference from this passage. A reasonable inference from this passage would be something like that. I mean, among others, there are lots of them. But one reasonable inference would be, let me see how they worded this other thing. My friend's bad knee is a primary source of the difficulties that he has been experiencing in his weekend basketball games. Okay. And I mean, the question that was raised here is sort of the same as the question that one might raise in regard to this passage. Like somebody might say here, somebody might say something like, how do we know that this is a primary source? And I mean, okay, if you are thinking about this stuff like a programmer, then this question makes sense. Like, I get why people are asking this question. They're asking it because it's like, well, technically, we don't know if this is a primary source. Maybe they decided to, like, mention a secondary source instead. But here's the deal. The deal is that, and don't forget this, don't forget, the passages have to be, I mean, they're good writing. Like, the one thing about these passages, they're boring, sometimes they're complex, difficult, hard to understand, but they are not bad writing, and they are not illogical or, like, nonsense passages. So the passages must be written in a way that actually makes logical sense. So remember what we talked about with regard to, like, this. Sorry, that's not the right one. With regard to this kind of inference right here. Statements that you can't rigorously prove, but for which it would be ridiculous if it was false. Like, you know, you can come up with exceptions, but the exceptions don't make sense and are not reasonable. Like, this is one of those cases. If this were not a primary source, then that would mean they wrote this whole passage with the express purpose of deceiving you. You know, either that or they're just really stupid people. I mean, because, like, if I say blah, 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 blah about my friend and having trouble in basketball, and then I only give you one reason for that, then that only makes any sense if that is a primary reason. Like, it doesn't have to be the only reason, but no one is going to write a passage where they say, you know, my friend has a hard time playing well in basketball, and then ignores all the biggest reasons and gives you some stupid side reason. Like, no one is going to do that. That's not how passages work. That's not how writing works. I mean, again, if you're thinking about it like it's a math problem, then you have to consider things like that. But these are passages. They are passages that have a logical flow and that makes sense from, like, a main idea, common sense kind of standpoint. So because passages have to have a logical flow, that's how we know this. Like, the only way in which this writing makes any sense is is if the mentioned reason is a primary reason. Because it's the only reason that we mention. So if like this falls into the case of inferences that you can't rigorously prove, but to which the only objections are nonsense. Like the only objection to this inference is, what if the author decided to ignore the primary reasons and give a secondary reason? Not reasonable. Like that is not going to happen. So same sort of thing here. The only objection to the word primary here is, what if the author decided to ignore all of the primary reasons and just give you a secondary reason? Not going to happen. So let me know if this makes sense to you guys. Smiley face if it does, especially the person who asked the question. Give me a smiley face if this makes sense. If you're giving me another face, make sure you type a question that explains why you're giving me that face. Like if you're finding something not understandable here, then make sure you type a question in the text box, please. Okay, otherwise we'll move on. One of you guys gave me the non-smiley face, so if you did, then ask a question. But yeah, you have to, like, remember these passages are not collections of random statements. Okay, they're passages. They have themes. Like the sentences in the passage have to do with the other sentences in the passage. So that's the takeaway that you should get from this. Like they're not going to spell out all of the relationships between everything, because they don't have to. Like they assume the reader does have a certain amount of common sense with which they're approaching this stuff. So don't think like it's a programming task, and don't think like it's an academic mathematical task, because it's not. It's a reading task. So remember that these are passages. They are not random collections of unrelated statements. So you are expected, it's the same thing you have to do when you figure out main idea questions. You are expected to figure out the relationships between the statements in the passage, because that's what you do whenever you read anything. Like there's nothing that's more than one sentence that is unconnected entirely. So you got to figure this out. So like when you read this passage, they expect that, you know, if they say blah, 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 blah happened, and here is exactly one reason why, then they expect you to pick up on the fact that that is an important reason. Maybe not the only one, but at least of some sort of primary importance, that it's the one that they decided to talk about. So you got to do this. If you're not seeing relationships between statements, you are going to be in big, big trouble when it comes to this kind of stuff. Any questions? If not, we're going to go ahead and move on to another problem. Let's look at this one. Okay. So, and also they have reasons for saying things. That's another thing we're going to, I mean, if that statement doesn't make sense to you, it will shortly. But here's another GMAT prep problem. I'm going to clear your answers. Again, please answer with the buttons that are available at the left. Please don't answer in the text box. Here's a new passage and question. I'll give you, you do have to read the passage or search it, so I'll give you about 2.5 minutes to do this. Go for it. Okay, apparently people are having a hard time here, but remember that you're looking mostly or even entirely in the neighborhood of the given statement. That you got to pick something that has to be true based on the facts in the passage and on the way in which the passage is written. So take another If you need it, take another 20, 30 seconds. Go ahead. Okay, let's just let it rip at this point. It's been over 3 minutes now. So please pick something, even if you are guessing. Remember, that's how the test works. You have to pick stuff. So go for it. There's okay. The only person who hasn't answered, there's Jani and there's Masabiel. I don't know how to pronounce that. Masabiel, maybe. Remember that you only click your answer once. If you click it twice, it'll make it go away. So, all right. Okay, here are, let me shrink the text here a little bit. And so we can write on here. All right, let's talk about it. The region of the passage that we're looking at, high inflation in the US and many European countries. There it is. It's that highlighted area of the passage. So, there you go. So let's talk about it. Process of elimination is a good way to go here. But notice what's going on with the answer breakdown. The class, here's the class statistics. So we are kind of all over the place of this one. There's no majority answer here at all. And moreover, the correct answer was picked by relatively few people. So let's talk about it. Okay, so it fit the rational expectations theory of inflation, but not the inertia theory of inflation. So we need to go find out what these things say. The rational expectations theory is that it's caused by this, and the inertia theory is that it's caused by this. The problem is that we don't have any idea what caused it. Like, there's no information in there at all about that. Like, if you look at the information there, all they tell you is that they managed to conquer the inflation by doing blah, 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 blah. But these theories are about what causes inflation. That idea is just not addressed at all. So A is not right. In fact, if you look at the way this is written, whether they support this theory or that theory, they agree that, I guess the line spacing was a little bit weird here. Sorry about that. Whether they agree with this or that, they agree, regardless of which theory they support, they agree that this stuff is necessary to decelerate inflation. So they point out, so, you know, we're not going to be finding points of disagreement between rational expectations and inertia theory, because this is a point on which these people agree. It was possible to control without causing a recession is quite the opposite of what the passage is saying. The passage is saying economists agree that these things, policies which cause recessions, are necessary, and then they point out that. I mean, if you want, you can read what they point out that, but this wording means that they are giving you an example of the previous statement. So that they are presenting evidence for the previous statement. So you can actually kind of stop reading right there if you figure that out. Like, whatever they point out here is going to be something that shows you that you actually do have to cause a recession in order to get rid of inflation. So this is the opposite of what B says. If you have questions about any of these, please type them in the text box. It was easier to control in those countries by applying tight monetary and fiscal policies than it would have been elsewhere. Other countries are not discussed at all. So this is kind of just made up. A lot of people picked this choice, so I'm wondering why. But there's no discussion of how hard it would have been to control these things. I'll fix the typo in a second. There's no discussion of how difficult this would have been in other countries. So that they just don't really talk about that. They say that they had to do these things in the US and Europe, but they don't really mention how hard this would have been in other countries. D is incorrect for the same reason that A is incorrect, because we just don't have any idea what actually caused this. So let's talk about E, which is actually the correct answer to the problem. And remember that there are two ways that you can infer things. Okay, let's go back to the other question for a second after we type a couple of words here. There are two different sources of information from which you can infer that things must be true. All right, the first of these, which clearly very few people are going to have issues understanding this one, is the actual information in the passage. The problems we did last time were mostly based on the actual information in the passage, and so once you got a hang of it, they weren't that bad. On the other hand, number two is it's kind of like what we were looking at before with that other question about a primary source. It's the way in which the passage is written. Okay, you got to keep in mind you have to apply common sense to understand how you have to understand the relationships between the things in the passage. But there are two basic principles here. The first basic principle is that the statements are there for a reason, and you need to figure out what that reason is. And the passage will be written in a way that makes sense. So what you need to do is you need to reject interpretations that are like mathematically possible, but are ridiculous given the way in which the passage is organized. So this is kind of what we saw with this statement right here. I mean, if you're thinking, like a computer programmer, then you might actually consider the case in which I give you a statement, and then I only give you like a completely unimportant side reason why that statement is true. But that's not, if I'm a writer, I'm not going to do that. Like if I say my buddy is having trouble in basketball, and then I give you one reason, you know that's a big reason. Because if it weren't, then you would be like, what's wrong with you? Why are you not telling me the big reason? So this is not a factual inference. It's like, why are they writing the passage this way? And that's a big part of reading comprehension. Because, this is super, super important in business. Like when people write memos, they are not going to spell out all of the reasons why things are being said. They're going to make statements, and then they're going to make other statements. And they're going to expect you to figure this out. Like if you get a business memo that's like, my colleague Jones is, having poor effects on the productivity of the company. And the next sentence says, he's always sleeping on the job. And that's the whole memo. You know that sleeping on the job is like the big reason why Jones is having poor productivity. You know that it is. That memo would not make sense in other ways. And so they're expecting you to read these passages in the same sort of way. So you can't just read them as if they were a bunch of random statements. You have to think about, what is this all about? Why did they write this here? What is this doing here? So like in this passage, here's where you're looking. You're looking at, they conquered high inflation by these countries' standards. That blue box. Why is this comment here? What's the only reason that they would write that comment? Text box, please. Like if they actually go out of their way to say, oh, by the way, it's high inflation by the standards of these countries. What does that mean? Yeah, it means not only is it relative to those countries, but it means that there are other countries where it would not be considered high. So, and if you don't see why this is true, let me give you a little bit more pedestrian example of why you know this. Like, let me give you another example. Let's say that, here's an analogy. Let's just do it in the corner of the screen. Yeah, that's what they're saying, and that's why that comment is there. And I mean, the point that I'm trying to make right now, and the reason why I'm giving you additional examples, is to show you that these are things that are obvious in real-world contexts. The difficulty when you do it on the GMAT is the difficulty of not shutting off your common sense. Because, like, for example, let's say I tell you the following. Let's say that I have a cousin who is 6 years old. And I say, my cousin can run really fast, in parentheses, for a 6-year-old. I mean, you know what this means. This means that, I mean, obviously it means my cousin can objectively run fast. So, it means my cousin can run fast. But the only reason to inject this comment is that, you know, if my cousin were racing other people, then he wouldn't be fast anymore if he were racing a bunch of adults or something like that. So, but not necessarily fast by the standards of other groups of people, such as adults or older children. I mean, this is, again, you would all figure this out in the real world. Like, okay, like one thing, for example, let me just give you one more example of this, just to show you how universal this kind of stuff is. Okay, a background fact in this case is that, two background facts. Okay, first of all, one fact that all of you probably know is that the quant scores on the GMAT go from quant, I think the lowest score is 3, up to quant 51. 51 is definitely the highest score. One fact about this is that people who work in nonprofit tend to have relatively low quant scores. So like people, applicants with nonprofit backgrounds have relatively low quant scores. You know, as compared to, you know, tech people who tend to have very high quant scores. Okay, there's your background. if I make the following statement, if I say something like Annette, who works in nonprofit, Annette has a high quant score for an applicant, or if I say relative to other nonprofit applicants. What does that mean? Like, under what circumstances would I write this? Text box, please. A couple of you are typing. Okay, someone wrote as a qualifier. What does that mean? Okay, but what does qualifier mean? Like, tell me what I mean when I say this. That's what it means. That last comment is what it means. It doesn't mean that she works in nonprofit. I mean, she does. If you say relative to other nonprofit applicants, then that means that Annette is in nonprofit. Like, that's a fact. If you say other nonprofit applicants, we know that she is one. But what this means, like, let's just imagine someone actually saying this to you in the real world. Well, Annette has a high quant score for a nonprofit person. What that means is that she has a high quant score relative to other nonprofit people, but not relative to, like, you know, tech people or something like that. So this means that her score, her quant score, is higher than most nonprofit people's quant scores. But it also means that her quant score would not be considered high among some other groups of applicants. Like, in other words, if Annette has a quant score of 51, then this statement would make no sense at all. Like, it would not be mathematically false. I mean, if you're looking at these things like a programmer, then you would say, oh, that's true. But if Annette has a perfect quant score, then you would just say Annette has a very high quant score, period. So, like, one of you called it a qualifier. I mean, okay, if you put a qualifier here, it has to be there for a reason. You know, like if you say my cousin is very tall for a Filipino guy, that means he's tall relative to other Filipinos, but maybe not relative to other races of people. My cousin can run fast for a 6-year-old. Okay, he can run faster than other 6-year-olds, but not faster than everyone. Annette has a high quant score relative to other nonprofit applicants. In other words, this is here for a reason. And that reason is that if you put Annette into other groups of comparisons, this would not be true anymore. The good news is that this is exactly the way these things work in conversation. Okay, most things don't work the way they do in conversation. This does. Like, if somebody said this to you, they would absolutely expect you to understand all of this that follows it. Like, if someone said this, then you would absolutely be expected to understand this. Like in any normal conversation. She has a high score for a nonprofit person. That's what it means. That's what the person expects you to pick up on. So luckily, this kind of stuff is the same as it is in conversation. So there's good news and there's bad news here, if you want to think of it that way. The good news is these things work the same way they do in conversation. In other words, like, why did the author write that will yield the same conclusions or the same reasons as why did this person say that? It's not the kind of thing, you can't memorize rules for this. It's not, I mean, because you can't memorize rules for common sense is basically what it boils down to. But the good news is you don't have to. Just think about these things the way they would work in conversation. The bad news is that if you process the passage as though it were a bunch of disconnected factual statements, or if you think like a programmer, so to speak, then it will be impossible for you to figure out these questions. So the idea is when you look at the connections between statements, you have to think about what the connections would be in the real world. So same thing here. If they actually bother to write this, then that's the reason. The reason they're writing that is that it's high in those countries, but not high in some other countries. Because if they were high everywhere, they would just write high and then go from there. Smiley face if this makes sense, including all of the additional examples and so on. I mean, this is really important because that's why it's called reading comprehension. You have to kind of get what these people are driving at. So sometimes your things are just based on the factual content of the passage, but more often than not, it isn't. Like more often than not, you actually have to you look at the relationships between the different statements and be like, why? What is this going on? Okay. Let's look at one more before we quit. Let's see. So there you go. Try this one right here. Okay, I'm going to clear your answers. You know the drill. Please respond with the buttons. Okay, I'll give you maybe 2.5 minutes. Go. Okay. Please pick something. Raj, Billy, if you have to guess, please go ahead and guess. This will be the last problem that we do today because we do have to end pretty much on time today. Okay. So here are your statistics. In this case, we got a very strong signal in favor of A. So it does look like you guys are learning how this works. So let's take a look. The disturbance, the highlighted text is, in this case, rather than highlighted, it's bolded. So an aspen grove needs to experience a fire or some other disturbance regularly, or it will fail to regenerate and spread. So what it doesn't talk about here is, or what it doesn't do is it doesn't spell out the connection. So again, this is another one of those ones like the others we were just looking at, in the sense that you have to figure out why they are putting certain things in certain places. So what is this? Because what will never, ever, ever happen in these passages is for you to just have some random stuff that has nothing to do with anything around it. It's not going to happen. So what does this have to do with anything? So let's talk about it. It needs to experience a disturbance or it will fail to regenerate and spread. This is in the same paragraph as the stuff that comes above it. You know that there must be a relationship to this stuff right here. I mean, you know, the things, because again, you got to ask yourself, why did they put these things in the order that they put them? Paragraphs are paragraphs. They're organized around themes, and they are not random. So there must be a relationship between these two things. And there must be a close relationship. Because otherwise they would not have put these in the same paragraph. So just keep this in mind. If two things are in the same paragraph as each other, there's going to be some sort of very intimate connection between them. So here's the deal, and the closer you get to it, the more likely it is, because the paragraph has to flow. So what they just got done saying is if a clone loses a lot of stems at once, then here's what happens. The only way that this comment can make any sense is if it has a relationship to that. Because otherwise it would be like, whoa, they totally changed the channel on me. So what's the relationship? Someone type in the text box. I mean, they don't spell it out because they don't have to. But ask yourself, why is this statement placed right here? This green statement. Does anybody want to comment on that in the text box? Like, what's the relationship of fires and disturbances to the stuff in the preceding part? A couple people are typing. That's what it's got to be. I mean, because otherwise it would be like, why is this here? You know, like for instance, if you say, like, let's say that you don't know which countries are in which continents. I mean, again, so it's kind of a stretch, but I mean, I need to think of an example off the top of my head. So again, think about why the statements are organized in the way they're organized. So, for example, if you say in different regions of Colombia, comma, the spoken Spanish language exhibits considerable variation. So there's a statement, and then if in the same paragraph they say something like this, if they say in Medellin, the pronoun vos is used almost universally for you in informal or intimate conversation. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, and in other cities in Colombia, they use tu instead of vos, and in other cities, it's a class indicator. Let's say that you have no idea where Medellin is. If you've never heard of this city before. I don't know where Medellin is. You have to figure this out. You can't expect them to tell you this. Like, they just got done saying this, and then they start talking about, oh, that was bad. Then they start talking about Medellin. So the only way that this would make any sense at all is if Medellin is in Colombia. So even if you have no idea where this place, Medellin, is, now you know where it is. Okay, and some people make the mistake of reading these things as though they were like random statements. Like some people would be like, well, how do I know that Medellin is not in Asia or something? Well, you just look at it and you're like, this is definitely meant to be an example of. So from the organization here, you can deduce that Medellin, even if you've never heard of it, it is a city in Colombia. So this is the same thing. Like, the only way that this insertion of this sentence here makes any sense at all is if this is a situation that causes the clone to lose a bunch of steps. So this only makes sense, I'll fix the typo in a second, if a fire, or let me fix the typo. This only makes sense if a fire or other disturbance is something that causes a clone to lose lots of stems. If this were anything else, it would make zero logical sense. It would be like, why are you doing that? Why did you change the channel? So you can figure that out, and then from that, you can figure out that, because that's what they say, it leads to a hormonal imbalance. So this is the correct answer. So there you go. The problem with B, C, and D is that they're not really supported by anything. They're just kind of made up. And then E is not correct because it doesn't say this. Like, it doesn't say that fires actually destroy coniferous trees. What it says is that fires prevent them from invading. Like, if you read these words right here. So in other words, they don't have to be destroyed in the first place because they're not there. So fires prevent the coniferous trees from invading in the first place, i.e. they don't have to destroy them because they aren't there. Okay, we need to wrap up at this point. So if there are any quick questions that are related to like admin or business type stuff, Billy, please type your question in the box. If you have any quick questions that are like business related and such things, then go ahead and put those in the box. Okay, that's a lot of words. Let's see. Okay. All right, we gotta go in about a minute, but let me see what I can do with this question in about 1 minute. I mean, you're not allowed to assume things beyond what the passage is talking about. Like, notice that we're not going out of the scope of the passage here in any way. But you do need to assume, you do need to understand why things are where they are in the passage. I mean, you do have to understand the organization of the passage. So, I mean, when you write, we have to assume that the disturbance is strong enough to kill a stem. Again, you have to ask, why is this here? I mean, if we go back to this example with my friend playing basketball, I mean, you could raise the same objection and say, well, how do we know he has to run up and down the court at full speed? Like, how do we know he's not just as effective as a basketball player if he runs at half speed? But you don't do that because you have to understand the organization of the passage, and you have to understand why statements are located where they are located. Like if I put this here, it is implied that this is a reason that is preventing him from playing basketball well. And similarly, if this is placed here, again, it's what we said. It's not the factual information. It's the way it's organized. Because they put this here, you know this is something that causes the clone to lose many stems. Because if it is not, then the whole organization of the passage is kind of stupid nonsense. I mean, it's kind of like this. If Medellin is not in Colombia, then why would I write this here? So, even if you don't know this, now you know this. I mean, they do expect you to pick up on this. And it's actually an important skill for real-life reading comprehension tasks in which you also have to pick up on this kind of stuff. Okay. We are out of time. I don't know if you're going to be typing much longer, but I have to go in literally like 5 seconds. So here's an email address that you can send this question to. Go ahead and send it to that question, to that email address. But the basic deal is you have to pick up on anything that is a reasonable function of the way the passage is organized. That's the short answer. In any case, we got to go. I'm going to go ahead and log you guys out in the next minute if you are not already gone. We are out of here. And thank you for attending. Have a good 2 weeks. We have our next study hall on June the 16th. It'll be a little bit later in the day. And fantastic. Have a good one. I will log you out in the next 30 seconds if you are not already logged out. Thank you. See you in a couple weeks.